On the night of 21 September 1327, inside the cold stone walls of Berkeley Castle, the former King of England, Edward Roman II, awaited a fate so gruesome that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to record its details. The world outside slept under a moon veiled by drifting clouds, but inside the castle's inner chambers, a terrifying drama was unfolding. In that moment, the power struggles of England's crown collided with one of the darkest episodes in royal history. By dawn, rumors would spread across the kingdom of a death so cruel, so unnatural, that it would stain the Plantagenet dynasty for generations. To understand how Edward Roman II found himself imprisoned, humiliated, and condemned to a death that many described as burning from the inside, one must go back nearly 2 decades earlier, to the beginning of his troubled reign. Edward ascended the throne in July 1307, after the death of his formidable father, Edward I, a king celebrated for his military strength and political ruthlessness. Edward Roman II inherited a realm shaped by conquest, especially in Wales and Scotland, but he lacked his father's discipline, strategic brilliance, and intimidating authority. Instead, he earned a reputation for emotional dependency, favoritism, and poor political judgment, traits that would destroy both his rule and his life. At the center of Edward's early troubles was a young knight named Piers Gaveston, a man of charm and refinement who captivated the king from the moment they met. Edward showered him with lands, titles, and influence far beyond what the nobles believed appropriate. The barons seethed with resentment, claiming Gaveston manipulated the king and mocked the aristocracy. Chroniclers noted that Edward and Gaveston were inseparable, a bond so intense that it overshadowed the king's duties. Whether their relationship was political, personal, or something deeper remains debated, but its consequences reshaped England's history. By 1311, the powerful barons issued the ordinances, limiting royal authority and forcing Gaveston into exile. Edward resisted. He recalled Gaveston repeatedly, each time provoking the barons' anger. The conflict climaxed in 1312 when a faction of nobles captured Gaveston and executed him without the king's consent. This moment scarred Edward emotionally and politically. He never forgave the barons, and the kingdom watched as loyalty fractured across England's power structure. After losing Gaveston, Edward turned to another set of favorites, Hugh Despenser the elder and his son, Hugh Despenser the younger. Unlike Gaveston, the Despensers were hungry for political dominance and wealth. Their influence corrupted the royal court. They seized lands, punished rivals, and manipulated the king for their own gain. Edward, blinded by attachment or perhaps desperation, allowed the abuse to continue. The barons revolted again in what became known as the Despenser War. Fires burned across the English countryside as rebellion grew, and trust in Edward crumbled further. Amid this unrest, Queen Isabella of France, Edward's wife, emerged as a central figure. Their marriage, arranged for political alliance, became strained as the Despenser family rose to power. Isabella, increasingly isolated and insulted by the Despensers, found herself pushed aside in both court and marriage. She left England in 1325 under the pretense of diplomatic negotiations with France, but what she built abroad was not a treaty, but an army. In France, Isabella formed a shocking partnership with a rebellious nobleman, Roger Mortimer, who had escaped imprisonment in the Tower of London. Their alliance was both political and personal. Together, they gathered supporters, funds, and military strength. By late 1326, they launched an invasion of England so swift that Edward Roman II barely had time to react. The king fled westward with the Despensers, seeking safety, but one stronghold after another surrendered to Isabella's forces. The collapse of Edward's power was total. Hugh Despenser the younger was captured, subjected to a public trial, and executed in a display so brutal that crowds reportedly gasped at its cruelty. Edward, now alone, broken, and abandoned by nearly all his former allies, was captured in November 1326. No longer a king, he was paraded as a prisoner through his own realm, a symbol of failed leadership and royal downfall. In January 1327, Parliament declared him unfit to rule. Under pressure, Edward formally abdicated in favour of his 14-year-old son, now King Edward Roman III. The former king was placed under guard, transferred from castle to castle, always watched, always silenced. His captors feared loyalists might attempt a rescue. Isabella and Mortimer feared something even more dangerous, that Edward Roman II's continued existence could inspire rebellion against their new regime. By the summer of 1327, Edward Roman II was held at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a remote fortress perched above the River Severn. Its stone walls, cold corridors, and damp lower chambers became the final prison of a fallen monarch. Reports from the time describe his living conditions as harsh, even intentionally cruel. Some accounts claim his jailers were instructed to break him physically and mentally without leaving visible marks, ensuring no sign of torture would betray an unlawful killing. Inside Berkeley Castle's lower quarters, Edward endured isolation, deprivation, and psychological torment. Guards reportedly beat drums near his cell to prevent him from sleeping. Food was served spoiled, light was scarce. Even chroniclers sympathetic to Queen Isabella admitted that the conditions were so horrific that disease or despair alone could have killed him. Yet Edward lived on, and this became a problem for Mortimer and Isabella. So long as Edward Roman II remained alive, rival factions might rally around him to challenge the new leadership. The easiest solution was a quiet death, one that left no mark of violence, no wound that could be blamed on human hands, something that could be explained away as natural illness. This brings us to the chilling events of that night in September 1327. According to several medieval sources, including the famous but controversial Brut Chronicle, Edward Roman II's executioners wanted to leave no external sign of murder. What they allegedly devised was a method of killing so barbaric that it defied human comprehension. The chroniclers wrote that a red-hot metal rod was inserted into the king's body to burn him from the inside, destroying his organs while leaving his skin unmarked. Whether this account is literal, symbolic, or exaggerated has been debated by historians, but what is certain is that Edward's death was shrouded in secrecy, fear, and political necessity. No eyewitness testimony survives, but later writers describe screams so loud that guards stationed outside the castle claimed to have heard them through thick stone walls. By the next morning, Edward Roman II was dead. England awoke to the announcement that the former king had died of natural causes, a claim no one fully accepted, and yet no one dared to challenge. What remained was a legacy of failure, betrayal, and unresolved mystery. The death of Edward Roman II revealed the darkest nature of political power in medieval Europe. When a king became a threat, his crown could not save him. The morning after Edward Roman II's mysterious and terrifying death, the halls of Berkeley Castle remained unnaturally silent. It was 22 September 1327, and the thick mist that hung over the castle grounds seemed almost symbolic, concealing the truth as effectively as the conspirators who orchestrated the king's demise. The announcement was swift and calculated. The former monarch had passed away from natural causes, weakened, they claimed, by sorrow, illness, and the harsh conditions of imprisonment. But even in an age accustomed to brutal politics, few believed such a convenient explanation. Before diving into the immediate aftermath, it is crucial to explore the deeper political tensions and personal rivalries that created this deadly turning point. Edward's fall from power had not simply been the result of poor governance. It was the culmination of years of resentment, humiliation, and political vendettas, orchestrated by some of the most ambitious figures in England and France. Queen Isabella, often portrayed as the mastermind behind Edward's downfall, was known throughout Europe as the She-Wolf of France. Yet her story is far more complicated. Born into French royalty as the daughter of King Philip Roman IV, Isabella grew up in a world of scheming politics, betrayals, and shifting alliances. She was married to Edward in 1308, only 11 years old, and thrust immediately into a political arena dominated by Piers Gaveston. She watched as Gaveston mocked her, as Edward elevated him above her in ceremony, and as the young queen's position became increasingly precarious. Over time, her resentment hardened into resolve. However, Isabella alone did not topple a king. Roger Mortimer, her lover and co-conspirator, had escaped the Tower of London and fled to France, where he found the Queen prepared to undermine her husband's authority. Mortimer was not just a fugitive nobleman seeking revenge. He was one of the most brilliant political tacticians of the era. He understood England's discontent better than most. He knew how deeply the Despensers were hated and how vulnerable Edward had become. Together, Isabella and Mortimer positioned themselves as saviors of the realm, gaining widespread support among disillusioned barons. When Isabella's invasion fleet landed at Orwell in September 1326, nobles, commoners, and rival factions welcomed her with open arms. Edward's authority collapsed almost instantly. It was not merely his failure as a ruler that doomed him, but the sheer unity of everyone who stood against him. The king found himself cornered, not by foreign enemies, but by his own subjects. Once imprisoned, Edward became a symbol. To Isabella's supporters, he represented the downfall of tyranny. To his loyalists, he was a victim of betrayal. To Mortimer, he represented a remaining threat that needed to be erased if the new political order was to survive. This threat explains why Edward was moved repeatedly between castles after his abdication. Kenilworth Castle, Corfe Castle, and finally Berkeley Castle were chosen for their remoteness and defensibility. Each transfer served a purpose: to avoid rescue attempts and isolate the former king from any allies who might plot his return to power. Berkeley Castle was a particularly strategic choice. Its thick walls and fortified towers ensured no unauthorized passage. Its remote location made communication nearly impossible. Most importantly, the castle was partially controlled by the Berkeley family, who were politically aligned with Isabella and Mortimer, ensuring absolute loyalty. Inside those grey stone walls, Edward's captors sought to break his spirit. Chroniclers describe his treatment as deliberately cruel. Some accounts state that he was kept in a room above a pit filled with rotting animals to torment him with stench. Others claim he was starved for days and denied warmth during the winter months. Whether all these details are accurate or exaggerated remains debated, but the intention is undisputed. The exiled king was meant to suffer, not merely exist. The secrecy surrounding his final night remains one of the most chilling parts of his story. According to certain medieval sources, 2 men were dispatched to carry out the murder: Sir Thomas Gurney and William Ockley, servants loyal to Mortimer. They allegedly entered Edward's chamber under cover of darkness, accompanied by a strange device designed to leave no external wounds. This device, sometimes referred to in chronicles as a horn or funnel, was used to inflict internal burns. Historians caution that such details may be symbolic or exaggerated, yet the consistency of these accounts across different sources suggests that something unusually cruel occurred. After Edward's death, Isabella and Mortimer faced immense pressure to maintain control. They convened a council, ordering preparations for a royal funeral. The body of the former king was transported to Gloucester Abbey for burial. What happened next gave rise to more suspicion. When witnesses later claimed to have seen the corpse, they reported no visible injuries. But rumors persisted, whispered across markets, taverns, and noble halls, that Edward had been killed in a way no blade or poison could reveal. This secrecy did not end with his burial. In fact, The shadows surrounding his death only deepened as political tensions escalated. Within a year, the young King Edward Roman III began to realize that he was king in name only. Power rested entirely in the hands of Mortimer, who acted with increasingly tyrannical authority, enriching himself, punishing rivals, and suppressing dissent. Isabella, once seen as a liberator, grew equally feared. By 1330, Edward Roman III could no longer tolerate Mortimer's dominance. The young king orchestrated a bold coup, storming Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel with a small band of loyal knights. Mortimer was seized, dragged before Parliament, and executed for treason. Isabella was confined to Castle Rising, her political career effectively over. During Mortimer's trial, Edward Roman III refused to allow any discussion of his father's death. This was one of the most telling decisions of his early reign. By blocking all inquiry, the young king preserved a political balance. If Mortimer were found guilty of murdering Edward Roman II, Isabella would be implicated as well, and Edward Roman III would be forced to choose between condemning his mother or tolerating injustice. He chose the path of silence. This silence allowed the mystery of Edward Roman II's death to grow into legend. Some medieval writers claimed the king had not died at all, that he had somehow escaped Berkeley Castle and lived in obscurity as a hermit in Italy. While almost certainly untrue, these stories reveal something important. The official narrative of his death was so unbelievable, so surrounded by secrecy, that people rejected it entirely. The political reality, however, was clear. Edward's death ensured the survival of Isabella and Mortimer's regime during its critical first years. It removed the single strongest symbol around whom rebellion could gather. It allowed the new king's rule to begin without immediate civil war. Yet the manner of his death, whether embellished or not, exposed the brutal nature of medieval power struggles. For centuries afterward, historians, writers, and chroniclers grappled with Edward's legacy. Was he a weak king or a misunderstood one? Was he a victim of political necessity or personal betrayal? And what truly happened inside Berkeley Castle on that night in 1327? What is certain is that Edward Roman II's death became one of the darkest symbols of political cruelty in European history. Kings had been murdered before, but few deaths captured the imagination of medieval society like his. His fate demonstrated how even the crown could not protect a monarch from the ambitions of rivals. It also revealed a deeper truth about medieval politics. Legitimacy was fragile, and power was often secured not through justice, but through fear. The death of Edward Roman II did not vanish quietly into the chronicles of medieval Europe. Instead, it echoed across the continent, provoking fear, suspicion, and fascination. By late 1327, whispers of foul play spread far beyond England. Merchants carried tales across the Channel, monks recorded rumors in their manuscripts, and nobles debated privately what had truly happened inside the walls of Berkeley Castle. Although Isabella and Mortimer insisted that Edward had died naturally, the circumstances were too convenient, too politically perfect, and too shrouded in secrecy for anyone to fully believe the official explanation. To understand why the story of Edward's death refused to fade, one must first understand the larger world he inhabited. Medieval Europe was a place where kings were believed to rule by divine right. The murder of a monarch was not only a political crime, but a spiritual calamity. It could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, a potential curse upon the realm. Stories of royal murders were recorded with extreme care because they hinted at disorder and danger. Edward Roman II's demise took place at a moment when Europe was already destabilized by conflicts between England and France, struggles with Scotland, and internal baronial rivalries. In this world, the mysterious death of a king mattered profoundly. The first wave of suspicion emerged among clerics who saw Edward's fate as a moral warning. Some monks wrote that his soul was tormented because of his sins as king. Others argued that the unnatural cruelty of his death proved that his captors had violated God's law. Chroniclers like Adam Murimuth, who lived during the time of Edward's death, expressed grave doubt about the official narrative. They recorded that many people believed Edward had been murdered, although they avoided writing the gruesome details that later writers would describe. Medieval chroniclers had a complex relationship with the truth. They often blended facts, rumors, and moral lessons, but even they found Edward's death too suspicious to ignore. The mystery deepened as different accounts emerged. The most famous, though written decades later, was included in the Brut Chronicle. This narrative described the horrifying method by which Edward was allegedly killed, claiming that a red-hot poker was inserted into his body to burn him from the inside. This method was said to leave no external marks, thus maintaining the appearance of natural death, although historians today debate whether this account was literal or symbolic. The idea was shocking enough to take root in the medieval imagination. Yet this was not the only version of events. Some chroniclers suggested that Edward was suffocated by heavy weights. Others claimed he was strangled with wet cloths to prevent leaving rope marks. A few even speculated that he simply died of despair, grief, and neglect. The wide range of possibilities reveals how little was truly known, and how much was deliberately concealed by Isabella and Mortimer's administration. But perhaps the most extraordinary twist in Edward Roman II's story came not from rumors of torture or murder, but from claims that he had escaped and was still alive. Around the year 1336, nearly a decade after Edward's supposed death, a letter known as the Fies he letter surfaced. Written by a papal notary, Manuel Fieschi, it alleged that Edward Roman II had escaped Berkeley Castle before the murder took place and fled across Europe. According to the letter, he passed through Ireland, France, and the Holy Roman Empire before finally living out his days as a hermit in Italy. The letter claimed that instead of being murdered, Edward Roman II had been rescued by sympathizers, substituted with a body double, and smuggled out of England. The story was fantastical, yet the letter was addressed to Edward Roman III himself, and contained details only someone familiar with court affairs would know. Although most historians do not accept the letter as factual, its existence proved how unresolved the question of Edward's death remained even years later. Adding to the confusion were reports from several Italian chronicles that a mysterious English hermit had lived near the town of Sasima in northern Italy during the 1330s. Locals believed he was a deposed king in hiding. When some travelers from England visited these regions, they wrote of hearing similar legends. These accounts, lacking firm evidence, were filled with contradictions, but they revealed one essential truth. Europe did not believe Edward Roman II's death had occurred as officially claimed. The political consequences of his death were equally significant. After Edward Roman III overthrew Mortimer in the dramatic coup of October 1330, the young king sought to stabilize his realm. But to do so, he had to navigate the complicated legacy of his father's fall. Publicly accusing Mortimer of murdering the former king would have risked implicating Queen Isabella as well. It also carried the danger of reviving political unrest among factions still loyal to the old king. Edward Roman III chose silence as a political strategy. However, this silence did not extend to the treatment of those directly responsible for overseeing Edward Roman II's imprisonment. Thomas Gurney, one of the men rumored to have killed the king, fled England shortly after the coup. He was eventually captured in France, but died mysteriously before he could be returned for trial. William Ockley, the other alleged conspirator, was never executed, but he lived under suspicion and infamy for the rest of his life. Their fates only reinforced the perception that they carried dangerous secrets. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella faced a different form of judgment. After Mortimer's execution, she was confined to Castle Rising. Although she lived comfortably, she never regained her political influence. Many believed the confinement was a punishment for her involvement in Edward Roman II's downfall, even if the young king never publicly accused her of murder. Isabella spent the rest of her life in quiet seclusion, plagued by rumors, guilt, and the lingering shadows of her former power. Edward Roman III, on the other hand, became one of England's most successful and admired kings. His reign saw the rise of the chivalric ideal, the founding of the Order of the Garter, and major victories in the early stages of the 100 Years' War. Yet even in his triumphs he could not fully erase the stain of his father's end. The manner of Edward Roman II's death remained a topic of fascination and unease, a reminder of how fragile the monarchy could be when political ambition turned deadly. What made Edward Roman II's death so significant was not only its brutality, but its symbolic meaning. His downfall exposed the fragility of medieval kingship. A monarch who lost the support of his nobles could be deposed, humiliated, and even murdered. The divine right of kings meant little when political intrigue, personal vendettas, and military alliances conspired against the throne. His death also revealed the power of narrative in shaping history. Because the truth was concealed, legend filled the void. The image of a king burned from within, trapped in a castle dungeon, betrayed by those closest to him, became one of the most haunting symbols of medieval politics. It also revealed the tension between public and private power. Officially, kingship was sacred and protected by divine authority. Privately, it was vulnerable to manipulation, betrayal, and violence. Edward Roman II's story became a cautionary tale for future rulers. A king must command respect, loyalty, and authority, or risk losing not only his crown, but his life. The political culture of England would be permanently shaped by the memory of his fall. European rulers took note. Across France, Scotland, and the German principalities, nobles whispered that if an English king could be so easily removed and murdered, then no monarch was truly safe. As a result, Edward Roman II's death played a subtle but powerful role in shaping the future of royal governance. It encouraged future kings to strengthen their alliances, control their rivals, and protect their legitimacy with greater vigilance. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of Edward Roman II lies in the lingering questions that surround his final moments. Was he murdered with a red hot rod? Was he suffocated? Was he starved, frightened, or driven to despair? Or, as the Fies he letter suggests, did he escape and live out his days in obscurity? These questions continue to fuel debate among historians. By the time the 14th century progressed into its middle decades, Edward Roman II's death had become more than a royal tragedy. It was a political cautionary tale, a subject of whispered debate, and a moral lesson repeated by chroniclers across Europe. But it was also something else, a mirror reflecting the dangerous volatility of medieval power. His death, whether by torture, suffocation, starvation, or secret escape, shaped the political landscape of England for generations. The unresolved nature of his demise gave it a mythic quality, embedding it deeply into the cultural memory of Europe. To understand the legacy of Edward Roman II's final days, one must examine the long-term consequences that emerged under the reign of his son, Edward Roman III. The young king inherited a realm recovering from political chaos. The coup against Mortimer had stabilized the crown, but distrust simmered beneath the surface. Many nobles feared that supporting the wrong faction could once again lead to catastrophic downfall. Edward Roman III recognized this fear and learned from the mistakes of both his father and Mortimer. He strengthened his alliances, revived royal authority, and distanced himself from the scandalous events of 1327. Edward Roman III became a model of chivalric kingship, cultivating an image of strength, justice, and martial prowess. Under his leadership, England achieved significant military victories in the opening phase of the 100 Years' War, especially at Crécy in 1003, 146, and Poitiers in 1356. These triumphs restored England's prestige across Europe and reshaped the balance of power between England and France. Yet even as he solidified his reputation as a warrior, king, the shadow of his father's violent end lingered behind the throne. One of the clearest consequences of Edward Roman II's death was the transformation of royal imprisonment. After witnessing the disastrous implications of imprisoning a deposed monarch, future English kings took greater precautions when dealing with political rivals. Later rulers, including Henry Roman IV and Henry Roman VII, understood that a living former king could become a rallying symbol for rebellion. In the centuries that followed, deposed monarchs were sometimes quietly eliminated, exiled far from their homeland, or confined in ways that prevented them from becoming political threats. Edward Roman II's fate had demonstrated the danger of mishandling such a situation. The political memory of Edward's death also influenced the legal reforms that emerged during Edward Roman III's reign. Parliament became more assertive, seeking accountability for royal officials and advisers. The case of Roger Mortimer, whose overreach led to his execution, was frequently cited as a warning against allowing non-royal figures to accumulate too much influence. Edward Roman III worked carefully to balance Parliament's power while preserving royal authority. The lessons of Mortimer's tyranny helped shape the developing relationship between crown and nobility, a relationship that would eventually evolve into the English constitutional system. But Edward Roman II's legacy extended beyond politics. His death became a symbol in medieval literature and chronicles, representing the fragility of earthly power. Monastic authors used his story to warn against sin, pride, or favoritism. Secular writers depicted him as a tragic figure undone by poor judgment and misplaced affection. In some accounts, he was a sympathetic victim of cruelty. In others, he was portrayed as a weak and misguided ruler who brought about his own downfall. These different portrayals reveal how deeply his story resonated across medieval society. The ambiguity surrounding his death allowed it to take on a life of its own. Some chroniclers insisted that the method of his killing by internal burning reflected the moral corruption they believed he had brought upon the realm. Others viewed the story as a political smear, spread by his enemies to justify their actions. The medieval world often used symbolism to express deeper truths. Whether or not the infamous method of Edward's execution was literally employed, it conveyed to the medieval mind a powerful image of a king whose body and soul were consumed by the consequences of his failures. The legend of Edward Roman II's survival also played an unexpected role in shaping his legacy. The Fies y Letter, with its dramatic narrative of escape and exile, captured the imagination of later generations. Although modern historians largely dismiss it as improbable, the letter contained enough plausible detail to fuel speculation for centuries. It suggested that Edward may have lived for years after 1327, wandering Europe as a humble hermit, free from the burden of kingship but imprisoned by the weight of his past. While the story is almost certainly false, it speaks to the deep discomfort many felt with the idea of a king dying so violently. Imagining him alive allowed people to soften the brutality of historical reality. The uncertain fate of Edward Roman II also raised questions about the legitimacy of royal rule. If kings could be deposed and murdered, what truly distinguished them from other mortals? Were they not, as the medieval doctrine claimed, chosen by God to govern? The political crises of Edward Roman II's reign forced English thinkers, clerics, and legal scholars to confront these questions. Some argued that kingship was conditional. A ruler who violated his duties could be lawfully removed. Others insisted that deposing a king was inherently sinful and destabilizing. These debates laid the groundwork for later constitutional struggles that would shape English political philosophy for centuries. Beyond political theory, Edward Roman II's story influenced medieval and early modern literature. Writers used his life as a dramatic framework to explore themes of loyalty, betrayal, tyranny, and redemption. Perhaps the most famous literary treatment came in the 16th century, when Christopher Marlowe wrote his play Edward Roman II. Marlowe portrayed the king as a tragic figure whose downfall resulted from a mixture of personal weakness and political betrayal. The play revived interest in Edward's death and cemented the gruesome legend of his murder in popular imagination. Through Marlowe's work, Edward Roman II became one of the earliest medieval kings to achieve lasting fame in English drama. In addition to literature, Edward Roman II's death impacted religious thought. Some theologians saw his demise as divine punishment for moral failings. Others argued that his suffering was a sign of martyrdom, a king cruelly killed by usurpers. Although the Church never canonized Edward, his story sparked theological commentary about justice, divine will, and the responsibilities of rulers. The debate over his spiritual fate reflected the broader tension between earthly power and moral authority. Even centuries later, the mystery of Edward Roman II continued to provoke historical investigation. During the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars studied the available documents, chronicles, and archaeological evidence to determine the truth about his death. Some argued that the traditional account of internal burning was propaganda invented by later writers. Others suggested that Edward may have been suffocated, a common method of eliminating political prisoners without visible marks. A small number of historians entertained the possibility that the Fieschi letter contained fragments of truth. Although no definitive conclusion has emerged, the pursuit of the truth has kept Edward's story alive in academic discourse. In modern times, Edward Roman II's death has inspired historical documentaries, novels, and renewed scholarly interest. The story resonates because it involves universal human themes: the rise and fall of power, the dangers of blind trust, the cruelty of political ambition, and the haunting question of truth versus legend. It also reflects the dramatic and often brutal nature of medieval politics, reminding us that the past was shaped not only by kings and queens, but by the shadowy decisions made in castle chambers far from public view. What ultimately matters about Edward Roman II's death is not simply how he died, but what his fate represented. It symbolized the limits of royal authority, the consequences of political miscalculation, and the relentless struggle for control that defined medieval England.